solve interesting and complex supply chain problems. And here we are in Q2 of 2025, and shippers are still experiencing more of the same. Business as usual, which means a lot of complexity, a lot of disruption, a lot of uncertainty. Yet all the logistics leaders are still expected to meet their customer promises. They have to control costs, and it's a really challenging environment to do that in. So really, again, nothing new in terms of the challenges and expectations. But with that in mind, our friends at Shipium have built some really unique solutions that help shippers navigate these squeezes. And the solutions that they have are really purpose built to adapt to this really dynamic operating environment. So with that in mind, let me introduce Chris Gasser from Shipium. Chris, welcome to the show. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Thank you, Tara. Appreciate that. So, my name is Chris. I'm the CMO here at Shipium. I've had the good fortune of being here since the very start. It's been a great effort to help modernize some of the shipping tech across all industries. We were started just about a month before COVID started. So the first couple of years were pretty fascinating to build a business from the ground up during a pandemic. But if anything, it highlighted, I think, some of the topics we're about to talk about in this conversation around volatility, how much the world has changed, and what shippers have to watch out for.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. COVID was really the inflection point where I think
Yeah.
the awareness about VUCA, disruption, uncertainty, volatility, became really a modern problem. And that pace of challenge has not really slowed down. And one of the things that you and I talked about is how some of the problems that shippers face today are not really new. These problems are not new problems, but it's the scale and complexity and how it's just always something new happening, and that's the unprecedented piece. And I think when we were talking a little bit about how it's really hard to use legacy solutions, legacy tactics to manage all of this really challenging environment. So when we talk about legacy solutions and legacy tactics, not really keeping pace with today's problems, what does that mean? How would you explain the legacy solutions not meeting modern?
Yeah. Well, some of it is we definitely have a lot of empathy, I guess, to how tech process everything was kind of built over the years. I mean, one way to think about it is that if you put yourself back into the 1990s, it was mostly the big box era, right? And so it was expansion of stores and things like that. And so shipping technology was built under the assumptions of what a network looked like at that point, which was honestly pretty simple. You had a fixed number of origins, like, 2 warehouses or something like that, right? You had a fixed number of destinations, your 200 to 2,000 stores. You had a fixed number of SKUs, whatever could fit on the shelves. You had a fixed number of carriers, FedEx and UPS basically fighting it. The point is it was relatively simple.
Yeah.
And then around 2005, right, the world changed in 5 years. You had the advent of the public cloud with AWS in 06. You had the advent of the iPhone in 07. You had the recession in 08 causing people to go online to find cheaper prices. And then by 09, you had 99% of the population having broadband. The point is, like, the digital landscape shifted to power a different era of commerce, that the supply chain networks behind that had to shift. And so now think of that network of, there's still a relatively fixed number of origins, although you certainly have like shipping from stores and things like that. But now, like, every destination in the world is basically infinite. And you had way more SKUs because you had the virtual shelf and marketplaces and drop shipping. And you had all this money with VCs and PE coming in to support new carriers and so on and so forth. And so that technology that was very good for that era of the 90s and the 2000s was built under a lot of assumptions that just weren't compatible with how complex things got. So with that new style of complexity of just the macro world, like, it's not your fault. It's how reality kind of changed around you. When we say, or we think, or when customers talk about legacy tech within this VUCA acronym that you mentioned, which I love, is that it's also just like the veracity of the volatility and the complexity of stuff happening with tech built not necessarily for flexibility, for all the different permutations that it could take to optimize all of the different things, they're really kind of hamstrung with not much for automation, optimization, flexibility, innovation, stuff like that.
Mhm.
The industry has to kind of catch up with how the network has changed.
Yeah, for sure. I know that I think that's true with supply chain execution technology. It really is the same monolithic solutions that were essentially moved into the cloud. And also, I think part of what needs to be considered is when you think about building a strategy that can counter all of this volatility with probably a global operating environment that you described earlier, infinite possibilities for whom you're delivering to as a
Mm-hmm.
customer. It's not only that the supply chain execution technologies are not really able to keep up with that because they're architected around business rules. They can be hard to change. They sometimes don't talk very well to the outside world or understand what's happening in the outside world. So if you need to pivot, they don't do that. But I think there's also this aspect of how do you even set a strategy to counteract all of
Yeah.
this? Back in the day, not to date myself or anything, but if you were working with
Me too.
if you're working with a massive amount of data, like most companies are today when they're looking at how they fulfilled orders, there were no ways to really use that data in a meaningful way. You could put it into Access or you could put it into Excel, but you weren't really doing any simulations with multiple variables or multiple baselines and able to do really robust what if analysis. Now, has that changed in time? Yes, there's great supply chain modeling solutions that can be used to build strategies to counteract these things. But I think sometimes the challenge, even with those solutions, is that they may not be purpose built to solve logistics specific problems.
Yeah.
And I think in some cases, they're very disconnected from how you actually keep pace with executing against that strategy and make changes dynamically, quickly. So you can have a quick pivot in real time, depending on what's happening again in the world out around you. And so when we talk about building strategies that are data driven and based on sophisticated multi-criteria analysis, I think Shipium can do some cool things in that arena as well, using more cutting edge technology. Of course, when we say cutting edge technology, everybody's going to think of AI and ML and all that good stuff. So can you talk
Sure.
a little bit about how companies can build those strategies using today's modern tools?
Yeah, I think the most compelling modern point that you said that I'll use as a bridge. It sounds so like weird in 2025 to say this, but it's that with the utility of cloud tech now in terms of a product model, like the deployment of the actual technology
Mhm.
in a cloud-based environment. What that means, like it meant a lot in 2010, but in 2025 and our industry that's kind of catching up in that regard, what it means is that you can now do something like the same system that's managing shipping execution can
Mhm.
also be the system that's managing data aggregation, data synthesis, the data models, and then whatever front ends you might have on that in terms of analytics and simulation and whatever the case may be. The
Mhm.
reason why this is relevant is that you go through just the punch list of what cloud tech has brought to other industries, and now it's evident here. One is you have a much tighter integration of much richer data that can flow from an execution system into whatever might be the simulation system, right? It's just there. There's no bus between different things and data formatting and transformation, all that kind of stuff. But then the next is that uh, you have the confidence then of whatever you see on, say, the simulation side of trying to understand if you add a new carrier in the Northeast, how is that going to impact your cost per package? The
Mhm.
confidence of knowing that's going to actually what's going to actually happen, right, in the execution
Mhm.
system, because it's the same thing. And
Mhm.
then the third is that this then gives power for an operator to now lean into what is frankly here and what is modern, which is a lot of these ML and AI things.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is maybe we can talk about the topic of what is AI and ML in this case with like data. But when we think about it, it's really a story around models more so than a story around AI or ML, which
Mhm.
is that when you have a tight and a very rich set of data, you can now enact a model and work frankly with experts like JBF to like understand what are the right models for your business. But it's whatever you want. Things like time and transit models to predict what the delivery times might be, things like cost models. So you're now actually modeling costs to be more accurate in a predictive fashion of what surcharges might be. It's things like carbon models, like what's the actual like carbon neutral calculation of a particular shipment, inventory models, forward drain models, the list goes on. If you can have a constellation of models, you can now butt them up against each other in more of a probabilistic sense to say, well, probably getting these shoes to Terra is probably going to ship on Tuesday and is probably going to take this amount of carbon, right? And it's probably going to be this cost and probably the accuracy, right, at like this time of day. So like you have those things to now truly do AI and ML in a way that's modern to adjust as there's a blizzard in Chicago or a war in Ukraine or whatever other types of things might be.
Right, right. So going back to what we couldn't do before that we can do today, when I talk about multivariable considerations, you listed a few of those that are very relevant in logistics: cost, time, external risk factors like weather, as an example. And all of those things can now be considered. And also, what the solution is able to do, because it's built on this modern platform, is it can really take into account randomness and probability to solve these problems. And those are things that we could not do or could not do very well optimally, before we were able to use these modern platforms to help with solving these problems. So the scale and the problem solving is so much more sophisticated than it has ever.
Yeah, and one example to really bring it down to something just tangible here is that what we're really picking at is the difference between deterministic business rules, which has been the business logic since the dawn of time, right, within tech, versus models sort of informing the decisions, these like probabilistic models. So deterministic versus probabilistic. And what I mean by that is something like the business rules tend to really kind of collapse on themselves when the complexity gets really high. This like multivariant side of things that you talked about. So one example is we have a model around the concept of a volume limits within a carrier. So let's say you have a national carrier, FedEx, UPS, whoever, and they say, hey, 80% of your shipments have to go through us to get some sort of an incentive tier. Well, traditionally that's handled via business rules. And it's really hard to understand or guess or predict across, say, 80 million shipments, what 80% of those 80 million shipments is the right 80%, right? So optimizing that, reacting to it as things change, it's very hard with deterministic rules because you can imagine the permutations would be just insane. But when you flip it to more of a model where you're looking at things like the constraints of cost, speed, accuracy, carbon, whatever the case may be, you can all model and project out, well, probabilistically reserving this shipment to send that via FedEx tomorrow is better across the criteria. So we're going to instead do a full-blown rate shop. It's part of the 20%, right? This one. And you do that probabilistically. And that's one example, very tangible, of how customers are really optimizing within a real world scenario of a volume tier using ML to kind of do that. And you can't do that with business rules. You can only do that with more data and model and systems.
Yeah, and I love that example because I also think it ties back to legacy ways of running a logistics operation, which was very heuristic based. It's a static rule, which of course never accounts for those unpredictable things that are happening every day, as we discussed earlier. And I also think it's really interesting to tie into the concept of AI versus ML and how those produce different outcomes. Earlier, you said, oh, maybe we should touch on AI and ML. And I'll give a non-technical example as kind of a layperson here. My AI example is that we've got this smart home system in our house, and it runs our thermostat to control the temperature, and it can run lights on a schedule, but it's based on really these various inputs and rules that we have in our smart home system. But if I were to equate that to an ML example that's very similar, eventually, based on me fiddling with the thermostat, based on how cold I am at any given time, my house would not rely on the rules that I've set up any longer. It would just learn my preferences based on things that it's aware of happening in my home, and it would start to really tweak how my home is run on my behalf. And that's because AI is like the brain with its current learning, and ML is the ability to expand your knowledge and learn over time to drive these iterative improvements. And so when I think about also your solution, I think it's really important to kind of dive into that ML concept a little bit, because I think what's happening is the data is being used to learn and drive incremental performance outcomes over time. Again, it's not using this static set of inputs and rules. It can start there, but eventually it's using data to evolve its understanding over time to continuously optimize, because execution and simulation are one solution. So not only is it taking into account those external risk factors, it could be unrest, it could be weather. We all know the risk factors that impact logistics. Those are certainly considered, but I think it's just also looking at how the network is changing over time and using those external risk factors to, again, predict. And so the machine is essentially getting smarter without a human intervention.
Yep. And this is a really pragmatic example of a legacy versus modern tech. There was a question that was asked about things like the delivery times of shipping and how the fulfillment, like what's happening in the warehouse, might impact that. So say FedEx picks up at 5 p.m. versus UPS picks up at 3 p.m. and how that impacts the concept of really fine-grained accuracies and things like that. Mm-hmm. The interesting through line within the last minute is that when you look at how things change, which can be massive, the Suez Canal, or you're opening a new warehouse on the West Coast, massive things, or really small, which is that FedEx is saying, hey, we're now going to pick up at 3 p.m. instead of 4 p.m. at this warehouse. How do you change that condition, that simple property within your network? Mm-hmm. The legacy systems having to react to that and allow those kinds of changes. You have to file an IT service order. It's not a very low code or no code scenario, so on and so forth. Like, you can do it, but it's hard. And it's so weird in 2025 to talk about that, but that's the reality. Modern systems, cloud systems, et cetera, like you can just make that change in a matter of a minute. Yeah. And it propagates across the entire network, and it also propagates down to the models, right? So like the time and transit model that we use, it has all these different layers in it. And if I work, say, backwards, right? Like the really crazy stuff is all of the weighting in terms of what our data science team is doing, et cetera. The middle layer is like all of the real-time properties, like a blizzard in Chicago or Friday versus Monday, which is different than Cyber Monday, et cetera. But then like the core of it is your actual shipping operations and like when a warehouse can actually do fulfillment, how long it takes to do the fulfillment in that warehouse, when carriers pick up, the concept of package level detail and how that impacts, what carrier is probably going to be the one that's going to use it, like all those different properties that matter. All that's the stuff that goes into how a model actually reacts in real time, aka automation, to then inform the smartest decision that has to happen at that exact moment in time to make sure that it's the most optimized.
Yeah. Dynamic, predictive, easy to use, in the sense that it can take the burden off of humans, which requires effort, skills, time, right? Yeah. And I think that's the other, just to kind of wrap up with the idea of modern solutions maybe being a better, easier fit to solve these really complex problems compared to what we would have had at our disposal in the past. I would say that it probably eases the labor burden, easier time to value, and able to solve very, very complex problems in a dynamic, real world, cognizant way. And again, those are things that companies have always struggled with. I think many companies continue to struggle with those challenges, and using, again, modern solutions that are purpose built to solve logistics problems, those things can be overcome. Those things can be overcome.
Yeah. And the customer story we were talking about prior, that is such a good fit for this. That's sort of maybe the best kind of capstone on the topic. Mm-hmm. Is we had a Fortune 500 customer who uses a handful of modules across our platform. And they also use the simulation product. Mm-hmm. And what was really fascinating is that in Q1, this customer did 39 simulations, which seems weird to talk about, but if you talk to even like, say, Gartner, we're very close with our friends at Gartner and them giving us feedback. In the network planning and simulation space, running even one simulation is like a 2-month setup, and it's hard and it's disconnected, et cetera. Well, because it's all the same system, all the data is there, all the properties there, they made all these different tweaks from just small little things, right? Like say a pickup window, but also larger business rules that they were thinking of, like exclude this carrier in the zone. And then
Mhm.
really big things like they're starting to think about turning on how to ship from store. So they're adding origins and like running data through and stuff like that. The ability to run 39 simulations in a quarter, take a subset of them of like, oh, the impact here is actually really positive in terms of cost or whatever, and then
Mhm.
very easily just transfer that to the execution system. It's like, great, let's implement that and go. That's a really good crystallization of, I think, what modern tech does in terms of that closed loop side of it, where they
Mhm.
can leverage, frankly, people like JBF to be thinking through the strategy and see, and now see the possible impact on future changes before making them as they
Mhm.
work with you, and then actually see the result and then execute it with us.
Yeah, I love that. I love the story, and I think it again highlights the speed to value that we were talking about, and how you can link that strategy back to your execution. And there was something else that came to my mind when you were telling that story, and you were saying I think that they had run 39 simulations, which was almost unheard of. And I know that in working with modeling solutions or clients who are going through network design in the past, there was always this underlying belief that there was point of diminishing return for every simulation you ran, because again, it takes too long to implement, hard to connect it to execution. Once you've determined what a business rule is, it's always so hard to find
Yeah.
incremental value, because you can't wipe all of that away dynamically as you run a next simulation. And so most companies, to your point, are doing 1 to 4 models per year, because there's that, again, that belief in this diminishing return, too hard to find the value, realize the value. And you really just pointed out how these modern solutions like Shipium can incrementally find the value. And because of the hook back to execution with the closed feedback loop, it's very practical, it's very pragmatic, and it's very quick to realize the value. And I just love that. I think that everyone forgets that you can find those incremental wins, and eventually over time that compounding interest adds up to a huge benefit.
Yep. Yeah, there was a question in the chat as it relates to best practices with simulation. I think the best quick answer that I can think of is sort of a reverse of what you would expect, which is that because it historically it takes so long to set up these simulations, and what is the story that Tara just shared. The interesting thing is then the strategic premise is, oh my God, it's got to be big. It's got to be a big idea. Like we're opening a new warehouse and there's a whole bunch of setup, et cetera. It's actually the reverse that is the watchouts, is that because the time to value is so much higher, to get super fine grained, to then isolate more of a variable to see that impact and then do those permutations over and over and over again has turned out to be the better format, right? And as a result, you start to see the strategy shifting of only using this for really, really big things to now using it for relatively small things where you unexpectedly find like, wow, that had a major impact, like on a peanut butter spread across costs per package or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. It's great. Chris, any other closing pieces of advice that you want to leave our listeners with?
I would just say that as you think about how you modernize, right? And so if you choose to work with, I think, people that are leading a lot of these efforts, like JBF and Shipium as a partnership, think about the why, which our perspective is customer focus. Like I think the biggest thing that has happened is that the true modern companies that are making an impact are doing it because they realize that the supply chain is built from the ground up to serve customers. And when you have that as your anchor and your origin point, now the way in which you think about strategy with all these things we talked about, constraints, models, blah, 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 right?
Mhm.
But now it has a little bit more of a meaning that translates back to making the business more competitive, and because the world is crazy right now. And that like loop of like how you figure out how you're going to help customers, and that makes you more competitive, that then flows into better optimizations and automations that reduces costs, which then gives you more money to figure out how you can compete for more customers, which then gives more money back to optimizations and automations, right?
Right.
That kind of feedback loop or flywheel, so to speak, has been the operating model that has really popped within the last 2 years with our customer base. And so I would just encourage you to look at, like, you can start anywhere. And wherever you start, you're going to start on this journey then that is this flywheel, and it's going to help everything in the business.
Yeah, a lot of companies talk about building a competitive advantage through their supply chain competency, but I think you're saying it can be reality. This is not an aspirational, it is an aspirational concept, but it's not an academic concept. It's very achievable, and start with the customer in the forefront and then use modern tools to help you execute against that.
Yep.
Love it. Love it. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time today. It's always a pleasure talking to you and the folks at Shipium. We love what you're doing over there. For all the folks listening, we will invite you to connect with Chris and I on LinkedIn, connect with JBF and Shipium on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again, Chris. Good to
Awesome.
talk.
Thanks, everyone.